We begin because there may be others coming along, but we would like to get going. The pattern has been that we introduce each other once a session and then proceed from there. I'm Bob McCahey in the History Department.
I'm Rhoda Wilk, class of 1991, and been living with these women since junior year of college.
I'm Herb Sloan in the History Department, and I remember when Rona was writing her senior thesis on these women.
I'm Louise Pernicam, and I'm writing about the early suffrage movement, which includes some of these people.
Lillian Appel. I've been working at Barnard for 37 years, and I'm the daughter of a graduate from Barnard.
I'm Connie Graham, class of 71, currently the registrar at Barnard. I took a class with Bob, Lauren took a class with me.
And I'm Pat Auspice, also a class of 71. I was a history major, and I'm now writing about women who combine marriage and career, and Elsie Clues Parsons, an early graduate of Barnard, is one of the women I'm working on.
I'm Phil Amarato, Professor Emeritus of Biology, retired 11 years ago. But I still do a little bit of teaching, and I have a real interest, because I'm a botanist, in Emily Gregory, who's Barnard's first professor and a botanist.
Can we go back around?
Yes, hi. Sorry, it's all right, no worries. I'm Lauren Glover, class of 2009, and I am the Program Associate in Alumni Affairs.
And I'm Allie Zacon. I'm a junior at Barnard, and I've been helping Professor McCaughey with some of the research.
Okay, good, thank you. I thought tonight we'd talk about students, early students. So let's just break it. I mean, Allison and Ron and I have been conspiring over this, but I think the general agreement is we do about First World War. It's a reasonable break point. The first couple of years of the Gildersleeve administration, which goes on for quite a long time after that. So it's a 25-year chunk of time. And I can give a couple of just overviews of a statistical sort to get us going. This is how Barnard grew. By 1914, there'd probably been 450 odd graduates. That's the number. These are annual enrollment, excuse me. We're talking here about two categories of students. In the beginning, there were regular students, but also something called specials, which turned out to be students with quite specific interests: botany, science, chemistry, and for a little while music. What distinguished them from the regular students is they didn't take the entrance exam, and what that really meant, at least until 1904 or 5, is that they didn't have to prepare in Greek. But some of them may have just been there for 1 year. That group is largely taken out of the mix by about 1905. It happens to correspond, although I haven't found real evidence that it was connected. The elimination of Greek as an entrance requirement probably just suggested now those students really ought to be regular students or not come to Barnard. I had the feeling that Barnard was a little embarrassed by these special students as not quite what they saw themselves doing, and I'm not sure that there's an equivalent of those at the other schools that Barnard had already started to compare itself with. So let's see what else we've got here. So these are the graduates. Goes up at a pretty steady clip. By the end of the period, we're talking about somewhere around 130 or so graduates a year, which it makes for something between 500 and 600 students at any one time. And that may be as far as we want to go. Yeah, I'll just stay there. So we have two people who know much more about these students and this generation of students than I do. And let's start with one of them and then move to Allison. So Rona, tell us how you got involved with these students.
I actually got involved doing research on a paper, cultural history paper, on women's romantic friendships at Barnard, and which eventually grew into my senior thesis, and then actually as I went into grad school, I have my PhD from NYU in American history, began to write more broadly also about gender and performance in gender, and the way the early college, and I looked at some of the other Seven Sisters as well, but the way the early college structure really fostered this environment for these young women to really play around with notions of gender and sexuality and power in many ways. And so I've done quite a lot of work on looking at the way the college culture sort of fostered those ideas. And I also wrote a column actually when I was a senior on different early Barnard college culture, singing, dances, theater, the songs, the mystery ceremony, which was the freshman initiation rite, Ivy Day, those sorts of things.
Okay.
So,
Allison, tell us what you've been doing with and for me.
So I started out looking at involvement while at Barnard, so the clubs and the organizations that the women were involved in, and also with that I was able to see the evolution of clubs. It started out with very few, and by the end of the first class, there were a pretty good number, so it does show a lot of diversity of interests. Another thing I've been most recently working on is the paths that these women went on after graduating, so their careers, their spouses, how many children they had, where they lived, things like that, just gathering information. Another thing I also worked on was kind of like a timeline of the sorority, the whole sorority issue, which kind of starts from 1891 to 1916, where they were eventually banned.
Okay, so there's a lot of material around. I'm going to try to suggest that we might focus it on a discussion on a question. Who was Barnard intended for? Because it may well be different from who came. And if there is a difference, then this notion of Tale of Two Cities begins to have some relevance. Rona, you've been looking at this. Do you see some pretty clear mission statement about who the place is for?
well, my sense is that, and we've talked about this, is that it really does start as a very New York-centric place, where they want to attract the young women of the city. Obviously, they might prefer to attract the more socially advanced people in the city, but they sort of end up with a kind of mixed bag, especially I think sort of middle class striving families who want to better their daughters. I mean, what's interesting about early college women is there's, especially around 1880, 1885, 90, you kind of get a sort of break from the very earlier college situation, which is those were women, very middle class, who were coming to earn a living. They were coming to learn to be teachers or to have some sort of profession. By the 1880s, 1890s, you start to get girls who are coming, people say, for the life. And that begins, especially at the country colleges, Smith, it sort of changed the composite and the sort of general tenor of the college a little bit. And at Barnard, I think in some ways it starts, with a kind of mixed bag to begin with a little bit, perhaps even a little bit more than its contemporaries. Mm-hmm. There's obviously a pretty large, by any standard, Jewish contingent, and that's really the biggest thing. I mean, diversity at this time really means Jewish and Catholic for all intents and purposes. And the Jewish contingent is kind of an interesting component because you have people coming from the sort of wealthier upper German Jewish classes, but you also, not to stereotype, but if you look around at some of the names and some of the addresses, you are getting some of the, Eastern European, middle-class Jewish girls who want to move up in society. And you can probably, correlate that with where people were living and coming from. So, it's an interesting group that, and because I think they live at home, that also creates a sort of slightly different tenor than if the other seven, what will become the Seven Sisters. So it's, I think, to me, the big thing is, I think, the Jewish presence, and the Catholic presence. I think that's what really distinguishes Barnard from its other, sister institutions.
Well, but now we've got two things going here. We've got the possibility of a class distinction, and then the possibility of an ethnic, religious distinction. As between, one way I'm trying to get my arms around this is think the college gets going through the effort of an original board of trustees, and there are some people who are more involved in it than others. But if you look at the first board, there is some ethnic, religious diversity.
Right.
Obviously. Meyer and Schiff, and then there early on Frederick Cruder, a Catholic, joins the board. Had already been on the Columbia board. So there's something there, but another element of it is that it seems to me, with the exception of a couple of women, single women, who are connected to schools, who could well be financially well off, it's a wealthy crowd, and I have the sense that some of them are there thinking that this is a school for their daughters, and that's what they're intending or hoping it'll turn out to be, and it doesn't work that way, it seems to me. Some of their daughters are so much a part of New York society that they don't go on to college, and the others who do go on go to Wellesley and Smith and Vassar rather than going here. And I think there's some real growing concern on the part of the trustees and others about that, so that there's a kind of dissonance that is generated. I'm trying to think about the possibilities of doing it in terms of residence. Where do people live? We have that great advantage in this that they nearly all live in New York, as against being a national population. And if one can track down the neighborhood locations of them, may be able to get a little closer to whether there is a class difference of some considerable magnitude. There's some discussion of that. 3 or 4 different Barnard people take cracks at answering the question, who's the place for, and they almost always do it with 2 groups. Those who don't have to earn their living, or have no reason to expect to have to earn their living, and those who do. And there it is. And that presumably correlates with some other things. Let's see. This is family residence. I've got two spots where I can do something. This is only at the town level, although the next one will be a little bit. So we're overwhelmingly New York City. Out of region is such an oddity that any year I've looked at, it's less than 5%. Occasionally somebody shows up from Indianapolis, but it doesn't happen nearly as often as 14 people show up from West End Avenue or something. So this is a way of looking at it, and if you consider 1897 is the year that the city is consolidated, but if you took the top three, 60% are coming from New York City. This was a high figure for me, New Jersey, and it took me a little while to figure it out, particularly if this is the class of '97, because this would have been the last class that was over on Madison Avenue. That's a bit of a hike across town. I mean, once it's on Morningside, it seems there are lots of ferries going back and forth on all those towns in northern New Jersey, but that figure in New Jersey stays pretty constant as far as going. They're nearly all public high schoolers. They're a mix. There's an occasional Catholic in the mix, or at least an identifiable Catholic on the basis of either a membership in a religious organization or a couple of private Catholic schools from which they come when I have it.
And I doubt if this year, but eventually you're also going to get a small contingent from Long Island that's going to start
Yeah.
trickle in.
Yeah. Although I'm a little confused at this point as when Nassau County is created, because it kind of confuses the situation. But you're right, they start, there is...
And the LAWR eventually, may help things.
Yes,
as well.
yeah, it may. This is a better one. And this, I have addresses, so once I master, which may be a long time, GIS, I'll be able to plot these in Manhattan. So the Upper West Side, 27%, I mean, these are people walking to school from their homes, not from, there may be a couple of instances of people getting rooms, but it doesn't sound like that's the activity. At Upper East Side, that's fairly arbitrary, but I was just adding to it. So all of Manhattan, 39%. So again, the city is still 65%, and the outer region is still de minimis. The next year, Virginia Gildersleeve becomes dean and spends her whole professional career trying to get that number up. Not necessarily to get the other numbers down, but it's not inconsistent with that part.
Was there any residential? There was no residential.
Oh yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Good question. There are two moments when Milbank, Brinkerhoff, and Fisk goes up in '97. Fisk has one floor, I guess, given over to dormitory space. I think it's where the windows are on that side for 4 years, and then it was given up and given over to laboratory space. So there was a 4-year moment where 20 or so students would come on. There were people, one person I'll be speaking about, the bursar, who in 1905 or 6 is talking about that as the golden age, because these 20 slots were successfully attracting a few people from beyond. And then when it was shut down, we're back to taking people from West 114th Street or something of that sort. Then Brooks opens up in 1907, and the number I'm not sure of, but I think it's on the order of 200 accommodations. But it takes 7 or 8 years to fill it.
Plus you could buy into a suite. So if you know Brooks, right, you've got like the side room and the little middle room and the doors open. So you could actually create that as a suite of rooms if you wanted to. According to contemporary reports, they were actually every floor was a different color, and when you opened up all the doors, it looked like one big room.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure they also, in between Fisk and Brooks, rented space on Claremont.
An associate alumni group, I think, pulled that off. Yeah. Yeah.
Just to have a little something.
Yeah. So that they were under some sort of collegiate responsibility. Yeah. But that was a kind of year-to-year situation. Again, the impression I have, and it's confirmed, or at least there's anecdotal evidence of it. The reason I picked this class is this the class that entered in 1906, And this is where those of us who have gone through any of this material find the one, as far as I can tell, smoking gun that exists as far as Barnard's plans and how it viewed the situation. Where the bursar at that time, N.W. Liggett, writes an exasperated letter to George Plimpton, who was the treasurer of the board, saying in about 6 words, we have too many Jews, and others of foreign extraction. And they come from parts of the town that our trustees have never visited. And it wouldn't be so bad if, because we really ought to be able to accommodate some of them, but there are so many. It's a kind of tipping point argument and all of that, very much to the fore. We don't have Plimpton's response, although I'm continually hoping to find, because otherwise he seems, at other instances, to be on the side of the angels here. But Laurie Gill responds in some ways at that point and says, you don't have to worry, we're going to keep getting these wealthy girls. They'll keep coming, but they're not. I don't think there's much evidence of any increase at all.
But wait, Jews versus wealthy girls?
Which is
No.
funny because it's wealthy
Right,
Jews.
yeah, they got a 2x2
Exactly,
arrangement here.
says-
And of the Jews, my guess is, without being able to tie it down, but I hope to be able to when I can map their residence, that wealthy Jewish girls are there, but not in substantial numbers. So that an Ephraim Knox is something of an outlier, Sarah Strauss, something of an
No,
outlier.
I went to Lewis.
Yeah, okay. I mean, there are, and as the number
I guess
goes,
those are the ones who made an impact, maybe that's
yeah,
what it is.
I think this,
Because they went on to do things.
I think there is that, yeah.
Made them on.
Or they came here with, some family standing that carries them through. But my sense is that that's not how Barnard makes it in the sense that it's going on.
So what about wealthy Gentile girls?
Uh,
Eleanor Roosevelt had friends who were here. And
Well, I haven't been able to find many. Anne Morgan, Mary Harriman.
Yeah, but Mary Herman, I think, was the one I was thinking of.
Yeah, they are here.
Lewis Comfort Timpany's twin girls come. I don't think they graduate.
No, they don't, I don't have them
I've
as
never seen them
graduates.
in-
Yeah,
I've never seen them in alumni lists. They're here through junior year at the very least, but
yeah,
and they obviously go up.
yeah.
Can you explain about Teachers College? Because those early special students, or would they then have gone, when did Teachers College start?
Before Barnard.
Because there's Georgia O'Keeffe, there's a whole bunch of
Right.
really interesting people who, under the watchful eye of John Dewey, become suffragists.
Yeah, there's an exchange program that is being sorted out during this period that Laurie Gill gets caught up with, and it probably cost her deanship. Teachers, college students, in order to get a degree, had to take courses at Barnard, some courses at Barnard. And my understanding is that then made it free for Barnard students to take an equivalent number of courses over there. So there is some considerable back and forth. Because TC was told at some point in the university consolidation that it couldn't have undergraduates, or it couldn't give an undergraduate degree. So it had students in a kind of pickle, and they'd come over to Barnard to be taken care of.
There was also an intense basketball rivalry.
I'm thinking about the art, I can't remember the name, but the correspondence between Georgia O'Keeffe and the person who became Alice Paul's first lieutenant. They were both at
Teachers College, yeah.
I mean, it's a
Quite believable, yeah. Let's see what else I think. Yeah, this has to be distinguishing Barnard from certainly the other sisters at this point. This is the breakout, and it's upon entering, so it's Liggett's own list of those who have been accepted and are supposed to be coming. So the end's a little different, but I think it probably shakes out pretty much this way. And to me, what was surprising is the small number of New York City privates, because the Board of Trustees has the headmistress of Spence, has the founder, Mrs. Joseph Cho, founder of Brearley, has a teacher, a high-up teacher at Brearley. So the board is represented, and Ella Weed is the headmistress of Miss Brown's school, which sometime disappeared. It wasn't there when my daughter was looking around for schools in the 1970s anyway. So, and Liggett's comment is that when Brearley or Spence send somebody, it's always a Jewish student. So it's only recommend Jewish students from their classes to Barnard.
And where do they recommend the others?
Presumably.
Yeah, yeah, and Radcliffe too. Radcliffe had probably, I think, Rosalind Rosenberg argues anyway, I think, had a comparable percentage of Jewish students, although I'd love to be able to slice the class out of that, because I think that's, it's New York money going to Cambridge, and a little of it left here. I mean, again, they're the same names. It reminds me a little bit about when Columbia talks about it being a great science university in the 20th century, and then once you get by Rabi, the conversation kind of slows down, you know, and the follow-up names are a little slow to come by. I think there's something going on here. Let's see if I have anything else. Oh, all right. Now this gets trickier still.
You can't tell.
So,
How do you know?
okay, that's what I'm going to tell you. I don't know. You don't know. You do know some things. You know, or I think, if you join the YWCA, odds are you're Protestant. And that accounts for the 50% right off the bat who signed. And I found there were one or two Catholics who joined it.
You could join as an associate up through,
Yeah, and I found one.
so a couple of Jews, a couple of Catholics.
Yeah. But this seems to be now. This is the light green is assumed Christian by virtue of being a fraternity member, where I don't know what their religion is. But if the sense of the opposition to the fraternities was that they discriminated particularly against Jewish students, and they don't, it would appear, against Catholic students, because I'm able to find Catholics in fraternity. So I'm just eliminating them from the possible Jewish contingent, and then possibly Jewish comes about in the following way.
For you.
Well, I think it's a better number than anyone else has come up with, which allows me plenty of running room.
For you.
To be possibly Jewish, you can't be in a fraternity. You can't, let's see what else. You get ticked by Mrs. Liggett as being either Jewish or foreign extraction of the first generation. And then when I look at the high schools, I get a break. If it's ethical culture, I tip a little more in that direction. And there was one other consideration.
Their involvement after. Their involvement after.
That's right. That's right. We're able to, and Allison's been doing some of that, tracking their alumni activities or their professional activities. So if they belong to a Jewish organization, then I conclude they could possibly have been Jewish back at that point.
This is like the world's worst GRE question.
Yeah, but if this is reasonably correct, it seems to me that the proportion And this, and then
What are
again,
they
Rosalind Rosenberg
complaining
picked, huh?
Yeah, so what are they complaining about?
Who's they?
Too
Oh,
Jewish.
Like a-
Oh, yes, no, that's where I didn't want to putting it that way, but that's what we come to the same conclusion, that the number has generally been overstated.
Yeah.
You know, unless, if all the unknowns are Jewish, they're just hiding, that would get you up to 23%, but there's no reason to think that they're not proportionally shaking out that way, so it may get up to 15%, but nothing more, and that to me was an interesting notion, and this is at the moment, this is the same class that Liggett is saying we're being overwhelmed.
But what was Annie Meyer's involvement with the college by this point?
She's trustee.
Because she's complaining all the time about Jewish women, but she means the ones on the Lower East Side.
Yeah.
It's a class contempt
Yeah,
thing
yeah,
in these years.
Right.
This is when she's starting to write about these
that's right.
unruly, you know, foreigners.
You know far more of her background than I do, but I'm at this point. I don't see her as a beacon for inclusion of Jews. She becomes offended in the 20s for what is pretty high-handed exclusion and involving people of her own social position as well. So she takes offense. But one of the tests, there are two places where some of this comes to bear, more than two. In 1909, Barnard gives up its own admissions arrangements and turns it over to a university-wide committee. Leroy Jones is the chairman of the committee for 20 years. Leroy Jones marries a Barnard graduate, and Wallace Jones, who was chairman of the Board of Trustees in the 60s and early 70s, at the point where the noose was tightening around Barnard, was chairman of the Board of Trustees. So it's an old name. And he runs the admissions. And he reports to Frederick Capel and then to Dean Hawkes, so that Columbia's policy is Barnard's policy. And as far as I can tell, that is perfectly all right with Virginia Gildersleeve. There are some trustees who are a little upset with that concern. But so that what I'm thinking one is possibly able to do is that the Barnard situation becomes somewhat similar to the Columbia situation, and what happens at Columbia College happens here at Barnard. And it is the case, I think, that both are, in this period, greatly concerned. My sense is, in an exaggerated fashion, given the numbers, that they are about to be overwhelmed.
The context has to be the rising tide of anti-Semitism in New York because of the immigrants.
Yeah, oh yeah, I think that's it, and the sense that someone like Capel or Hawkes in the early 20s can say this overwhelming situation is not to be made light of. Look at NYU.
Right.
That's that seems. And then if you go to the Harvard materials and you ask Lowell, he'll say this is a serious matter. He doesn't say look at NYU. He says look at Columbia. It's already happened there. So there's a kind of tougher range. So,
I'd
go ahead.
be interested to know in terms of the possibly Jewish, whether they really come from the Lower East Side, because I've never seen real Lower East Side addresses. I don't know if
No.
I don't. But they come from the north.
Yep.
Which is or
Yeah.
above the park.
Yeah.
Which is a kind of, at this point, I mean, my grandfather's family, which is a lower middle class professional family, Jewish immigrant family. His father was a diamond cutter, are living up at East 110th Street.
Yeah.
So my sense is that they're not actually really drawing from the unwashed masses of the Lower East Side, but kind of from a more lower middle class professional class of immigrants.
I think, and by 1906, there's a point at which the Jewish population in the Lower East Side hits its high point, and then leaks away.
And they start to-
They moved to Brooklyn, they moved to the Bronx, and there are fewer and fewer. What I've been looking at lately suggests that's around 1912, 1914. But you're right. As far as I can tell, there are very few students who come from the Lower East Side in that sense. But then there are Jewish pockets in other places in Manhattan where I think they are more likely. And to the extent that Harlem, before it became black, was Jewish, there's a big chunk of town to the north and east that would account for this. Also, this area is building, these apartment buildings are going up as you know every day, and if you were making your move both out of the Lower East Side and into at least the edge of middle class prosperity, you know, this might be the place. And you'd be renting, and your daughter is 16, and you come up here and spend 4 or 5 years here and move on. So it's a little tricky to figure that out.
I would guess that to us 12% seems minuscule, but I suspect to a Mrs. Liggett, 12% compared to a Smith or a Wellesley or a Mount Holyoke was enormous.
Yeah.
It's also,
And I think
it's the cutting edge of the wedge in a sense. It's the reverse of what we have now, where if our population of color goes up, that encourages more students of color to apply, and Barnard is fostering this. This is what we want. This is the opposite.
Yeah.
If you've got 12% Jewish, oh my God, next year you might have 15, and the year after that 20, because they're all going to cluster together.
That's right. Yeah. Oh no, I think the concern is genuine.
Oh, I don't. I think it's above a mindset. I think it's based on racial stereotypes and the general tide of
Well,
anti-Semitism.
except
Yeah,
look at
sincere,
the-
that's what I'm saying.
Oh, that's Barnard. But I think if you look at Barnard in the 30s.
No, I didn't say
40s,
realistic.
But the thing is, I think, and I don't know if you've gone that far, I think if you look at Barnard in the 30s and 40s, that number is getting a lot bigger.
Oh yeah.
You know, so it actually is the wedge in the, I mean, you know.
Yeah.
Yes, and especially because as Barnard went on beyond this time frame, we were such a heavily non-residential college.
Right.
So that the population of Jewish students, simply because the population of New York City was Jewish.
Right.
Not to mention the quota system
Can we talk
remains
about
in effect.
transportation for a second?
We can. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay, because as you know, my understanding of what happened in the suffrage movement is the subway made the difference.
Uh-huh.
That the subway, especially this one, that went up the Upper West Side, which opened on 103rd Street in 1904,
Right.
and I don't know when the next
I
ones
think
were.
like 7.
Yeah, I think it's 7.
Here too, okay. So I imagine that would affect when you get all the addresses. The ability of people to get here if they're not coming in private cars.
Right.
I was gonna ask, how did people even in the 1890s, how did they arrive at Barnard?
Streetcar.
Streetcars. Yeah. Yeah, and that would have been true
Did you
over on
ride
Madison
horses
Ave.
here?
That would have been true. Well, a horse-drawn, you know.
I'm sure the Tiffany daughters probably
Came in
Yeah.
carriage.
Yeah.
take.
I think that's fascinating, the whole business of delayed transportation affecting
Mhm.
all these social issues. But Annie Meyer's selling point was that there was no women's college in New York City.
Right.
So I wouldn't be surprised if, at least at the very beginning, that was the goal, to provide a women's college for New York City.
Yeah, I think, yeah, and
And then
and
the
for
story you're going to tell, other things happened, right?
yeah, that the women she had in mind don't come in the numbers that
Right.
would sustain the
Right.
institution, and yet at the same time it becomes extraordinarily attractive to kids who are going to public high schools that have suddenly become capable of preparing students sufficiently for college now that the college entrance board's exams are set up and Greek is eliminated as a pre-requirement. Wadley High School over on 14th Street opens in 1902, something like that, for girls.
Yeah, that's what my mother wanted.
All right, okay.
She was an immigrant.
Any reasonably bright girl there would graduate at 17, would take the test, and when it was the Regents test, they would take the Regents test, and if they passed the Regents test, Barnard was not in a position at that time to say no. Later on, Gildersleeve says that makes you eligible. That doesn't get you in.
And what did it cost?
It cost $150.
And what is that? I mean, what kind of family can afford to do
I tried to do that as far as an equivalent wage. It's $150 from 1889 to 1914. So by 1914, it is very cheap, and that's another turning point, I think. In 1914, the Regents of New York set up the scholarship program. So if you score high on the Regents exam, you will get a scholarship for 4 years, $100 a year. Yeah, so Barnard's charging $150. The board comes together, and the only reason we know this is that the chairman of the board, Brownell, wasn't there and wrote a nasty letter afterward because the board went against him. They decided to up the tuition to $200. It's been the same all the way along. And some of the board, taking Brownell, who was a descended from it, some of the board said this is an opportunity to increase our revenues because 71 students were at Barnard with these Regents scholarships. So rather than their parents getting it all back, Barnard was going to get a chunk of it. It's kind of argument. But there were others, and Brownell pointed to them, who worried that now there were no financial barriers to coming to Barnard, and because the college boards was the way in, that now you really were going to get flooded. This, you ain't seen nothing yet.
Now it's a meritocracy, God forbid.
Is the argument? Yeah, sure.
So a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Before this generous largesse from New York State begins to flood the picture, do we know who was getting scholarships to Barnard? I mean, were there people on the Lower East Side? You could look at the addresses of.
Yeah.
Really, I do not see Lower East Side addresses.
Okay,
I mean,
so if you're getting a scholarship, you actually.
I mean, the
live in
story is
some-
that Agnes Ernst, mayor, had a scholarship because her parents didn't want her to go. So, I mean, anyone really could.
Yeah.
I've never seen a real list or anything like that, but
Yeah, no, there are
I'm
some.
sure there must be.
There are some lists, and there are some. Pulitzer came up with two different, and it was controversial over at Columbia. He set up scholarships for New York City residents, which was just from public high schools in New York City, which is just the wrong thing to do. And then and at Barnard he set up 12 residence scholarships. So these were for people who did live out of town. They could come from public high schools, but they lived out of town and would take up residence in Brooks. I mean, it was another way of filling Brooks. There is in the Columbia archives some in the trustee business. A couple of people on the Barnard board wanted to set up scholarships aimed at students of good Christian character, and that got a little close to the charter of the university. And they went back and forth and tried to alter that. But there are scholarships, and they're ones that you compete for at the end of the first year. If you've done very well, the scholarship will be forthcoming. Barnard was reasonably well set with financial aid because Horace Carpentier gave them probably as much money for scholarships as Anderson did for building. So it was by 1915-16, for the tiny endowment it had, a big chunk of the endowment was designated for for scholarships.
That's the
Yeah.
population of, I'm sorry, you had more?
Oh, I just
Yeah.
have one other question to the changing pattern of women's higher education in New York City.
Right.
When does the competition come in? You know, when does Hunter College start, which must
Well,
have,
Hunter is going under another name at this point.
yeah,
It's called a normal college.
Normal, yeah.
yeah.
But there was a general sense that that was not an A-B program. It was
Okay.
a technical
And
program for
the
teaching
Myriad
certificate.
of Catholic women's colleges?
Yeah, Manhattanville was going. NYU begins to admit women at some point, but but I forgot.
Yeah, I can't
The graduate school and the law school
Yeah.
do. But there is an NYU undergraduate women's contingent. I think it's when NYU, the men move uptown, and I
Yes,
think the
and the
downtown is co-ed.
Yes, I think you're right.
And there is a, Roberta Frankfurt wrote a thing on it, but I haven't been able to find it lately. But, so there's a little competition. What else would come online? City College was men, so it was Hunter. I think Hunter becomes an A/B granting college of the sort that it is now, probably in the late 20s, early 30s.
Really, that way?
Yeah, which is about the time that Brooklyn College comes on.
Mhm.
So Barnard has a pretty good hold on the market for quite a while.
And Stern doesn't appear until way after the.
Yeah, I think so.
Second World War.
That's my sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
and Yeshiva the same situation, I think.
I just had a thought about the Lower East Side. I think you can stop looking because from the memoirs I've read of the immigrant generation, those girls are not going to go to college. Their work, even if they have scholarships, their income is needed in the family.
No, I think
So the
there is
story,
a bottom layer for
Yeah,
what.
it's not just about getting the scholarship, it's about giving up
Yeah.
the income.
Yeah.
And in those families, the boys would go if there was any extra money. But even more, that whole burgeoning movement of education on the Lower East Side, all the settlement houses and all that stuff, is where people say they went to study literature and
Yeah.
to study
Yeah,
all that.
alternative
So I
areas.
don't think that Barnard would have a reach there.
Well, that's
It's not-
that's we're finding that to be the case at the moment. Yeah, and it's not about transportation in that case. I mean,
Yeah.
theoretically they
You
could
know,
get
I-
uptown. But
Because when you said places the trustees had never been, I had just read something by one of the Lewison sisters who went to the Henry Street settlement and became the dramatics and all that person at Henry Street. And she said that when her father took her to the settlement, it was a neighborhood she had never been in or known existed. And it
Yeah.
sounded like
yeah,
what you said about the trustees.
Yeah.
It's a different world. It's really it's a ghetto. It's got a fence around it.
and on the upper end there are two different worlds. It would appear. I've been reading a book by Susie Pack. Do you know the name? On the J.P. Morgan banking community, or on the New York bankers. And the J.P. Morgan people lived in one part of town, and the Jacob Schiff people, Kuhn Loeb, lived in another part of town. Both equally wealthy and
Right.
pricey / exclusive, but they were 40 blocks apart.
Yeah.
I'm
And
trying
Schiffs
to.
and the Warburgs were neighbors.
Yeah, I can locate the trustees in this situation too, and I think then you're going to see. Yeah, you're going to see both this ethnic divide and I think a religious divide.
I just wanted to throw out just a little anecdotal thing when you asked about how did they get here, streetcars, and the kind of prominence of the streetcar in the life of a college girl. So Barnard used to have a freshman initiation rite called the Mysteries Ceremony, which especially in this period is given over to a kind of hazing ritual. And what would happen is the sophomores would prescribe for the freshmen a series of restrictions, like you couldn't wear your cap and gown except until May or something, or you had to wear a little bell with a green for fresh. on your thing to kind of, indicate that you were a freshman.
Clean, unclean.
But what's interesting is that in a couple of cases, what they do is they say you have to give up your seat on a streetcar if a sophomore gets on. So it's interesting the way the culture of the college actually spills out into the city itself.
Yeah.
Well, it seems to me, I may be getting this wrong, but at one point there was a major streetcar terminus at 110th and Broadway, I guess. And there were in fact several dance halls and beer halls, the last of which was the building that was torn down where West Side Market is to put up the new multi-story apartment building. You may remember that was a two-story building.
Yeah.
Strange facade.
Yeah.
And those were, that's where when the conductors had finished their shifts and so on and so forth, they caroused or recreated themselves or something like that. And when you think about women on streetcars in New York City, this was not necessarily a very safe environment. I'm sure from the point of view of parents, and for a woman to get on a streetcar and ride, 30 or 40 blocks up Broadway may have been, this required a degree of emancipation that all parents may not have been particularly interested in.
There was a group of women that tried to get a separate women's only subway car for that reason. They were getting pinched and everything.
And everything.
On the trains.
I've never been able to find it again, but I could swear at one point I found some sort of article or what that basically said that the college closed on election day because they didn't want the girls out on the streets in the middle of rowdiness.
I think that is what.
Then they-
We've come back to that.
Yeah.
Well, but the polling places were in saloons.
So,
So there you go.
yeah. How the fraternity issue fits into it becomes a little more complicated, I think, at this point, if it's not just one more instance of Barnard being out there in front and the progressive bandwagon, as a socialist club, as a suffrage club, has a couple of settlement houses organizations, and here, and doing in the fraternities is, just a piece of that whole action.
And in Vassar, as I'm sure you know, they weren't even allowed to talk about suffrage,
That's right.
let alone
The great
Yeah.
have a club.
Is that how you find it, Allison?
Now?
No, I mean, oh, but now may be relevant, and we can take you at your word. Yeah.
Dare to use the F word.
Actually, in the motor board archives, there's a list of all the clubs, and they have, the presidents and all that, and the suffrage clubs are pretty prominent there. There's
They put on plays, they were,
Yeah.
really in the.
No, I know, I'm just saying, Annie kept saying to the newspapers, suffrage is not popular at Barnard.
I think they all kind of said that. I mean, in all the Seven Sisters, there was a kind of downplaying of the.
But it wasn't forbidden.
No. But at Vassar it was.
At Vassar.
Which I sometimes wonder if Inez Mulholland showing up on that white horse was just a big FU to the people at Vassar for
She
keeping
started
her.
long before the White Horse.
Well,
She wrote the header for 1911 book.
so.
Anyway.
Well, I'm not. My sense is that beyond this period, Barnard confirms the direction it's taking here, which is not the direction that the trustees originally imagined, and that Gildersleeve never fully accommodates herself to it. McIntosh seems to be much more able to, this is what you get, the lemons are here, the lemonade will be made, rather than, whereas I think her own background would suggest she might have been as resistant. Quaker, yeah, and head of Brearley for 20 years, and really tapped into that money situation before coming
But also
here to Barnard.
tied into some of the Flexners, right? Mrs. McIntosh.
That I didn't know.
Yeah, I think
And
that's,
that was a suffrage family.
mm,
Who were they?
Eleanor
I think that's
Fletcher.
the sort of famous medical reformer.
Okay.
Somebody from Fleckner's marries into
Oh,
somebody who's.
well, if that's the case, then that doubles up with the Milbanks,
Yeah.
because they're medical money folks that have a run through the Barnard trustees almost uninterrupted. If you go from Mrs. Anderson, who bought the property we were sitting on and provided the funds for Milbank, and paid for Brooks. So those were three pretty big
Where
arrangements.
did that money come from?
Uh,
Where did the money
Condensed
come
milk.
Borden Milk.
Mm.
And they sold it off in the 1890s, and she was one of the richest women in the country, and created then the Milbank Memorial Fund, which continues to give Barnard money whenever we can come up with something to fall within its arrangements, so that that kind of connection continues on, and it's a moneyed connection. In Anderson's case, it's a WASPy connection, Baptist, Episcopalian, back and forth. And by the 30s, you're beginning to have that wealthy German Jewish connection represented in the trustees in considerable numbers. And by the 50s and 60s, it's very much part of what's going on. But earlier on, Protestant clerics it's probably the least sectarian private college that I can think of from the get-go. I mean, all that Meyer was, I think, interested in was, don't discriminate against us, and I see no resistance to Catholics that I can find. But that's also true of Columbia.
Was there ever a plan to build a chapel?
Yeah, there was, and there was a discussion of it, and there was a family, the Talcarts, who gave their big money to build the Bible Society building down. Didn't they just tear it down to replace it? I think down around the 60th.
Yeah, their plans have been made to replace the building's still there.
Oh, it's still there.
Yeah.
Well, that was big money that was sitting at the Barnard trustee table, and she spent most of her time on the board trying to, do something with a chapel, and she underwrote the YMCA trips to Silver Bay, someplace, conferences every year. So there was that element, but I don't, around the table there wasn't much support for that, as far as I can
Are
tell.
we the only one of the sisters that doesn't have a chapel? I mean, I don't know whether there's a chapel at Radcliffe, but I think.
I don't know. That's a good question.
Chapel used
And it would be
to
easy to
take
find
place-
out. That would be good.
Chapel used to take place in the Brinkerhoff Theater, which is the big, I mean,
But
at
this
least
was
three.
this was a
were.
kind of informal student.
Well, there was academic chapel. Where,
Oh,
which
okay.
was, and then I think I wrote you. I can't remember if there were non-academic chapels that were. I mean, in other schools there was compulsory chapel. At Barnard, I don't believe it's compulsory, but I would have to double
You
check.
mean
that.
religious services chapel?
All right.
Compulsive religious services?
Yes,
chapel?
I mean in other, or at least religion gets kind of smushed in there, even if it's.
Had a chaplain on the staff and so on. And so
Well,
Columbia.
there's a professorship funded for instruction in the Bible by this Talcott family. That Barnard accepts that.
I mean, there are
Funny.
lectures, religion is not completely absent, and eventually Emerson Fosdick, right, from Riverside, begins to come and lecture and teach and things.
But Earl Hall is already up and running.
Right.
Because the strange thing about Annie Nathan Meyer, for all her becoming an ethical culture, getting married at the Ethical Culture Society, she stands for the Jewish woman, but She gave a series of lectures
Mhm.
at Earl Hall on Jewish texts
Yeah,
in those years, in those early years.
yeah.
Would you imagine that both the smallness of Barnard's acreage, the footprint, would be a limiting factor in putting a building like that in a limited space, and the fact that we're cheap by jowl of so many other institutions?
Yeah.
I think
St.
that's
Paul's
true.
Chapel.
If you look through, scrapbooks and whatnot of this, you'll see they often will put in leaflets and flyers from things that they went to see. One girl went to see Emmeline Pankhurst speak. Another goes to a lecture at Riverside or whatever, but somewhere.
Yeah, I think
Or
that's right.
Marble Collegiate and what have you. I mean, these sort of progressive churches that are out there. So there's, the city. Yeah, I mean, it's very much, the way today we tout the city as, right, this is Barnard's laboratory.
Mhm.
That's from way back when,
Mhm.
of them going out and really bringing their interests out and then bringing them back to college settlements, have lectures
Yeah.
and whatnot,
Mhm.
that sort of
But
thing.
it does mean that Barnard doesn't have that special ceremonial space
Yes.
that other institutions all have. And, it may be that it's the chapel on Sunday, but it's also the place where this and that and the other academic ceremony takes place.
Where was graduation?
Hmm?
Where was graduation?
Well, it was,
Come out of Milford.
Where was
Milbank
graduation?
Courtyard.
it would be over at Columbia.
Yeah.
The university class then, or the Barnard?
I don't think there was a
There
Barnard,
was no Barnard
I think
class
that's,
day until,
yeah, I
I
think,
forget when, but
um,
it's early-ish, earlier than you would think, but it's,
yeah, and
well,
some of it goes no further back than the Matfield years, where she was trying, there's a parallel set of circumstances.
but what's interesting is that Barnard makes its own space. So, like, for example, when you have Ivy Day, where it starts out as Tree Day, and then eventually they figure out we don't have enough room to keep planting trees. So they switch to Ivy, which, as you can now see,
Down the jungle.
Bush Day,
yeah,
To put the
Twig Day.
Diana Center.
Takes place in the Milbank Quadrangle in the spring every year, as the seniors kind of hand over. They sort of look forward to keeping the ties together as this ivy will always grow and keep us bound to Barnard and to each other, and then they turn over kind of the responsibility of the college to the incoming senior class, the juniors who are going up, and that becomes part of what they call the step ceremony
And where did they do that?
in Milbank, on Milbank, in the front.
Courtyard.
Oh, sorry, that way. So they make that space. They hold like the junior ball / dinner. They hold it at places like the Waldorf. I mean, they again, they go out and create a space for themselves. The junior ball is a little different because it's one of the few places where it's one of the few dances, kind of events that men are allowed to come to. But but they use the Brinkerhoff Theater, which is now the Minor Latham Theater, for all sorts of things. I mean, I think now everything is permanent, but back then, everything kind of covered up. You could take the chairs went away, you could roll back the stage. There used to be a fireplace, I believe. So they had chapel there, they had dances there, they had theater, they had parties, there really was a pretty vibrant student life. I mean, I think it's a real point of credit to the earliest classes that they create such a vivid space for themselves, even with this limited thing. Each class has a class study, so that's a space in Milbank where the classes can come together, and then there's an undergraduate study, which is kind of more general. There's obviously the library. They used to eat lunch in Fisk somewhere. I'm not exactly sure where. And they really, especially once they get this tract of land, now you've got space to kind of, and there were pictures of like the maypole dance they used to do in the spring, right outside Brooks. They used to play baseball, so they found the space to
Where
do
did
that.
they go to?
They played baseball, I believe, in what is now the quad, I think.
And they played golf on the roof.
Oh, at some point, yeah. You know, and obviously they have the Greek games. I mean, the Greek games begin as a really purely athletic competition, complete with wrestling and a tug of war. And so it's a very physical culture at the beginning, which I've always found really fascinating. It's, you know, they're doing things that you would not necessarily anticipate. My favorite game includes, no offense to the professors around the table, but like they would, in some cases, burn their professors in effigy at their sophomore ceremony.
Well,
So, you know, and that was actually part of the original
But it's
mystery.
the time of the Gibson girl and the bicycles.
Well, yeah,
I mean,
and
it's
they
a
really,
physical-
yeah, and they work with that. You know, that's a thing.
It's not avant-garde, it's just of its time and place. That's a great detail.
Well, the campus looked very different then, right? 'Cause this
Yeah.
was known as the jungle.
No, the
Yeah.
jungle
Over
was
here.
where Diana Center is.
Right, and along the frontage, right? Along Broadway?
Yeah,
Were
from
there
what-
a few
from
big
when
trees
I
that
was-
still left?
When I was here, there were tennis courts and a jungle.
And a jungle.
Right, well,
The
first of all,
tennis
you've got-
courts are where our show is now, right? And
I used to
Yes.
study in the library in the last carol so I could look at the tennis courts, so it was right
Right, and obviously the streets used to
North
go
of
through.
it.
just north of.
When did they cut off the,
That I don't, it's definitely there through like the,
what, both 117th and 118th, or?
I think just the one that would, whatever it is that would have come in front of Millbank.
Oh, I didn't know.
Whatever street
Ah.
that is.
That
Yeah.
was closed when they put about Shul and Macintosh. I
Yeah,
believe.
well, that would make sense.
And the agreement was, since they were, if I remember right, that by virtue of closing a public street, those gates had to be open a certain number of hours each year.
Oh, that's
Right.
why they're
Like
open.
College Walk,
Ah.
Like College Walk.
same deal
Yeah.
on College Walk.
I mean, what's interesting too, if you walk around the Millbank complex, right, you'll see all these other doors that no one ever uses anymore, but there used to be
Yes.
exits and entrances, right, for every building, both within the quadrangle and then going out
On the
onto
Broadway.
Broadway
side,
into,
yeah.
and,
120th.
whatever, that, not West End.
Claremont.
Claremont. In fact, actually, if you look, I think it's also on the Brinker House side, but if you go to the Fisk, the door, right, so if this is Millbank, and here's Fisk, and here's Brinkerhoff, if you go to the Fisk door, that's like right there, you can still see the doorbell that that was there, because, you know, especially when it was a dorm, presumably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This makes me really admire Barnard. This history. It really does. I mean, it does seem like that very New York way of making things work
Yeah, they really did.
within the limitations that a city has, the dangers all around, and the small footprints, and the lack of huge endowment that we keep talking about. Somehow it's got that kind of New York spunk.
Hmm.
I think.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And my favorite incongruous thing is at the same time that they're, you know, burning professors in effigy and hazing each other and, you know, having wrestling matches, that they're not allowed to leave campus without a hat on.
Right.
That and the
So
don't
that's
forget-
inside outside.
That's inside outside, exactly, you know, and the you know, if you're going to use a spirit lamp, don't forget your asbestos tray.
Just one,
Awesome.
I know we're
Very
winding.
practical advice.
Very practical advice.
I know we're winding down, but I have a question, Bob. I don't know where this is, in some Barnard promotional material where I've seen it, the iconic photograph of the women who bring their tea sets to college. Where is that? It's in something. It gives the impression of this upper-class ladies' school, which is not. what
You mean
we-
in the dorm room?
Yeah, and they have their own tea sets and they had to bring them with them, it was part of the.
Dorm life is really interesting. That, I mean.
Is that an upper class?
No,
Marker?
well, yes and no. It's hard to, I mean, it depends on who's living in the dorms. But if you read anything related to women's colleges at this time, and they talk about someone's room, they created, I mean, there is really this ethos of you kind of recreate a kind of homey thing. So you've got cushions and chairs and screens, and this is the time when the Japanese influence is kept, so that people have all sorts of things hanging around, and lanterns. They cooked in the rooms. There's the whole. It's this little stereotype, but the stereotype is the college girl making fudge in her room over a little
Chafing dish?
chafing dishes. They used to have spreads. You get a basket from home, and then you'd invite all your friends for a kind of late night spread. Sometimes waited upon by younger, students as kind of waitresses. They really create these amazing. I mean, you look at these pictures. I've seen one picture where there's a bloody piano in the room. I'm like, my God, how did they even get it there?
On the subway.
It's just a different kind of. I mean, maybe some of us schlep refrigerators and computers and TVs, but they really recreated the kind of social graces in some ways, but in a very
It's not
collegiate
just
way.
Barnard. My mother went to Wellesley in the 20s, and
Yeah.
we still have her tea set.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
she was
And was it
not upper
choir?
class. I don't know.
Well, when my sister was an undergraduate at Wellesley at the end of the 1960s, they still had gracious living,
Yep.
and she had to pour tea once a week.
Oh.
And that was, Wellesley had this culture of work, that somehow every student had to have a job of some sort. And my sister's job was pouring tea on Thursday afternoon or
We
something
had that
like
at
that.
philosophy hall in the graduate English
Yes.
department.
Oh, yeah.
We had teas.
But those were faculty wives who waited on you in the philosophy hall. But when I was a graduate student, they were faculty wives. All right.
But I also have the image, like in many old movies, of the aristocracy of wealthy traveling with a woman who would travel with their tea chests. That was part of the accoutrement that the servants would carry out
Yeah, I'm really
into
puzzled
the
with
cab.
these
So
tea sets.
It was the tea chest.
But
Now, what
she-
was in the tea chest in addition to the tea set?
Open.
It's very interesting. You read a lot of college girl stories from this time, which are fabulous, and I highly recommend, especially Smith College Stories, which is just brilliant, by Josephine Dodge Dascom Bacon, because two names were not enough. She's actually very big in the Girl Scouts, if anyone is a Girl Scout alum. And there's always this kind of split. It's not really a split. The girls themselves kind of don't see it as antithetical. But this split between, the boisterous girl coming in all dusty from the golf, well, this is Smith, but, from the golf course in her, her short skirt and shirtwaist, and then kind of turning over and getting dressed up for either an evening out or off campus, or even just kind of, getting dressed up for dinner on campus. And that kind of tension, at least I think to the outside world, between the feminine, the more feminine side of things, and then this kind of slightly alarming to outsiders, boisterousness that seems very unfeminine in some people's eyes. And for the girls, I think it's not that kind of dichotomy. It's just, this is it. This is the life. And you can be as gracious, you can pour tea graciously and be a wonderful dancer and be, dress well and be, aggressive and murderous on the basketball court.
Well, I think that we sometimes forget, especially given how standards have completely collapsed in the last 50 years, at a lot of places that weren't necessarily big public institutions, but small private colleges and so on, just how sort of upper middle class the atmosphere was. And to tell another family story, when my father went to college in 1932, he took 2 sets of tails and a dinner jacket because at Washington and Lee, his southern school, this kind of dressing up was regular, and you had to send stuff back to your hometown in order to get it clean, so you needed an extra something in case of 2 events in the same week or
But my
something.
question is that aspirational or not?
No, two is you've arrived.
So,
If you rent, that's aspirational.
This is is a whole other, but we're sort of skirting the business of the ladylike behavior expected of Barnard girls. And so I will tell you that I was thrown off the tennis team for cursing in this college in 1960. How about that? But I don't know what this business and the tea sets and the costumes, it's hard to parse whether it's aspirational, you know, girls come and they're imitating something, or it is their culture.
Well, there were people on the board, and I think Gildersleeve is part of the same sentiment, people on the board before Gildersleeve became president, before she became dean, who, with the construction of Brooks Hall, had a vision of Barnard as eventually getting to that point where it would be able to attract and retain students of a high class level. And the building is decorated according to Helen Horowitz, who's at Wellesley, who looked at all the Seven Sisters and their architectural arrangements. It's designed to fit right into at least those schools with a certain urban touch to it. So it's urban elegant rather than country, but it's supposed to be elegant and
No stables.
no, because you didn't have the space, but that you decorated it as if you were down in yeah.
Well, Tiffany does the LOE, the LOE library fireplace, you know.
Didn't Elsie DeWolf
Yes,
design?
yes.
I mean, you could
Design,
do
yes, Elsie DeWolf designs
Yeah.
the Brooks living room.
Yeah, so if you were constructing a home in Newport, you would have her do it, and if you're putting up a dorm at Barnard, we hope, you know, you're going to do it the same
This
way.
is much more interesting than any histories that exist.
Yeah.
You need to write it.
Yeah.
Matt, in the little bit of time, I wonder if I could raise a little issue, if it's appropriate to pick it up.
Please.
If not, don't. In doing the faculty in biology, which for most of the years was botany and zoology, one thing that struck me in the very early years is the faculty and the way they trained. I mean, it's quite clear for the first 30 years, almost all the original faculty were basically, a couple were from elsewhere, Emily Gregory was from Zurich, and a PhD, and Herbert Moore Richards, who was the first full-time botanist after Gregory died, was Harvard trained. Most of them have Columbia PhDs, but there are several Barnard undergraduates that came in very early and had very long careers here.
Yeah.
One fits actually into this time period, and she graduated in 1912 and was Florence de Loisel Lefebvre, who was a language major, got interested in zoology, and upon graduation stayed with the department within 2 years, was on the faculty and stayed until 1950, eventually reaching the position of dean of students or something to that equivalent. And there's one a little bit later, 1918. Is there much of this across department lines of Barnard students staying on as the faculty?
There are.
I've seen people stay on as assistant. They don't.
Yeah.
See that a lot.
But some.
But like kind of for a few years, and then they go off and do something else.
Oh, but some stayed, as in the Lowther case, and Gildersleeve's a little defensive about it, because when you start, and I've been doing this, when you start tracking promotions, her notion was that you could always get a Barnard woman to teach here, and once they were here, they would stay. So when you had an opening, you hired a man, and you paid him what it took to get him here. And then she would go on and say, well, some might object to that, but that was the way it was done. And so I'm finding more Barnard graduates than I thought, but if you track, and they can start a year after they graduate, they can be here as an assistant.
Yeah. Right.
And then they're taking an MA at Columbia, and they're continuing that. And then they'll get their PhD, and they won't become an assistant professor, they may become an instructor. And they don't get on the faculty for 10, 15 years after that. It was a long haul.
It sort of explains the other thing I've noticed in that most of the departments at that time had at least 2 permanent faculty, and the other one would always be a man who came from elsewhere.
That sounds right.
Yeah.
That sounds right. And when, and they would replace and there would, I think the first woman chair that I can find is after the Second World War. And another aspect of that is that coming to Barnard as a man in the interwar period meant you had a fighting chance at getting picked up by Columbia and transferred. And the first time that happened to a woman was in the early 50s, woman in French.
That's why this women's college needed to have a women's center and a feminist movement.
What's also interesting is the restrictions on hiring women or keeping women who were married as faculty. And part-time was okay, but full-time was not okay. But Elsie Clues Parsons was unusual in that she taught through her first 2 pregnancies.
Yeah.
That's very unusual.
And they kept it because she was a part-time teacher.
Yeah.
I mean, Emily James Smith Putnam, who's the first real dean of the college, it makes history really by staying on after she gets married. She
But
comes
not
on as
when she
Emily
gets pregnant.
Smith.
Right.
But right,
She has to go when she gets pregnant.
She has to, it takes a few more years for that to become more of a...
Well, on this, thank you for the transition. We'll have I hope we can continue these in the spring, and we'll have a couple on the faculty, but I wanted to start with students. I interviewed Barbara Hertz, Barbara Schmitter, who had some Barnard connection in the late 1940s before she went off to California. And there were women here at that time who were pregnant and worried about the situation. It was a very close call, and this was in Millicent McIntosh's day, so you would think a fairly enlightened situation because she had 5 or 6 kids herself. But someone pointed out to me she also had 5 or 6 people taking care of those 5 or 6 kids.
Well, she used to harangue our class about how wonderful and easy it was to be a mother and an intellectual, and I would always sit there in my proletarian. Yeah, easy for you to say, you've got 7 servants.
Yeah. Well, when I came here, I thought there was still that. And I came in 1969, and I was only looking at the history department, writ small, but there were a number of women, but they were either single or there was wealth in the family, real wealth in the family, either husband or some other, professional. But that was the way it operated.
We did those statistics when we started the Center for Research on Women, because it was part of the rationale for why even a women's college needed a feminist movement, and they are somewhere.
Oh, that's good to know.
Kate Stimson might have them?
She might.
All right. Because it was about looking at those patterns.
Yeah.
Exactly those patterns.
Yeah.
Well, so I was just actually looking through some of the alumni magazines here from like the 20s and 30s, and there was an article about the single versus married alumni and and also who was working and who was not. I mean, eventually, Alison, I would love to know like kind of where you find stuff, because it seems to me like many of them did continue with careers after they got married and even after they had children.
The archives actually has a questionnaire that they send out.
Yes.
Yeah, that's where I found a lot.
Yeah, from the 50s, I think.
Yeah.
40s, I can't remember now.
They have it for every.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's really quite impressive. Yeah.
I actually wanted to just add one thing, just because when I didn't realize the Milbanks or the Andersons were born in Milk, and just to kind of maybe leave on a. So there was the president of the Undergraduate Society in 1912, who was the senior. Was Constance von Wall, who is actually responsible for the codified honor code that we have today.
And some prize.
Yes, and a prize. And the reason she has a prize is because she was one of the best actresses in the college. People thought maybe she would go on the stage professionally, but she was also incredibly bright. And she, upon graduation, got a job at the Borden Milk Company, working in their chemical research laboratory. And subsequently died a year later of blood poisoning.
Oh.
Presumably from her work. And they actually closed the college for the day to hold a memorial service. And the prize was set up in her honor.
Environmental danger.
Mm. Well, we've hit our witching hour. I hope we can do this in the spring. We may have to spread the carrots out a little thinner, but I think we can probably get the room. And thank you for some of the newcomers to the occasion.
And thank you, Bob, for putting this together.
It's all out of self-interest.
I know.